The population is the fastest growing large population with more than 450 breeding pairs.
Program Manager for Resource Conservation and Resilience within the Department of Defense. Kevin has spent nearly 30 years at the interface of science and management of fire-adapted ecosystems. His research career includes appointments as Deputy Wildland Fire Science Coordinator for the US Geological Survey. That's how my path crossed with Kevin. But he's also worked as a research fire ecologist at the Jones Ecological Research Center and the wildland fire scientist at Tall Timbers Research Station. His management experience includes state fire program manager for the Nature Conservancy, prescribed fire program manager at Eglin Air Force Base, and interim chief of the Air Force Wildland Fire Center. Kevin has published more than 100 scientific articles and has worked with partners to advance new tools for fire managers to confront the growing challenges of prescribed fire application in the modern landscape. And I was mentioning to Kevin as we were chatting about his slides that I don't think we've had a wildfire specific webinar in this series yet. And the topic actually came up, I believe, at one of the Tribal NERDA National Workshops several years ago, and it just took a little bit of time to get this organized. But as you'll see from Kevin's slides, there's some really good opportunities within the restoration realm to consider prescribed fire. So Kevin, with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll give you a verbal confirmation that I can see your slides.
Kevin is a graying bearded male with no hair on his head, wearing a light button-down shirt. His background is a wall with pictures of outdoor landscapes.
We get into slide mode. Are you seeing my slides there?
Yes, it looks great.
Fantastic. Well, it's a privilege to be here today talking about a topic that I am very passionate and familiar with, which is the application of prescribed fire for the restoration of ecosystems. And when Joe asked me to do this talk, I was serving as the Deputy Wildland Fire Science Coordinator at USGS, working for Paul Stebline out of Reston, and am recently appointed the Resource Conservation Program Manager at the CERTIP ESTCP program, as Joe mentioned. And so I apologize, I've been in transition, so my temporary office is, hopefully it'll last while we're going through the slides. But just real quickly, I want to start by just recognizing that fire is a global process, and it's a process that dominates ecosystem development, biodiversity, conservation across the globe, not just in the United States. If you take any monthly snapshot of fire detections from Hiers or the MODIS detections across NASA tools, you can see just the breadth of wildland fire. Now, these tools don't tell us whether they're prescribed fire or wildfires, but we know that most fire across the globe is intentionally set for objectives.
Two topographical maps are displayed with fire detection in red globally and in the United States. Kevin lives and burns in the southeast United States.
And really, fire ecology and our understanding of fire and restoration processes is pretty young. We had a watershed moment back in 1988 when Yellowstone National Park burned nearly in its entirety. And there was a large workshop the next year where my friend and a mentor, Norm Christensen, was quoted as saying the 1988 fires have laid bare the broad extent of our ignorance about those natural processes, really referring to fire as a process that we have to understand in order to restore ecosystems. If you looked at those Yellowstone fires, they covered most of the park. At the time, what we thought was a lot of damage. And over the last 30 years, it really has recovered at a tremendous rate. This is a picture I took in 2018 of the site that was in the first slide.
Burnt trunks sticking up from the ground with green flora growing on the ground. The second image is of burnt and new tree growth.
But the truth is that we now know that restoration in most forested ecosystems across the United States has to account for the fire ecology of that system. Most of these communities burn at some frequency. Many of them, particularly areas in the southeast and southwest, as well as the prairie states and California, burn frequently. And much of our restoration has to both account for that frequency, but then also plan for future fires in order to sustain those restoration efforts. Just starting in the southeast, 70% of all the herbaceous and low shrub endemic species occur in communities that are maintained by fire. And here in the southeast, we would consider them conservation reliant species because almost all of the fires, prescribed fire, set by humans for specific purposes. Now, there's a variety of objectives there, but most of the fire in the southeast, which is almost 6 million acres a year, is set by prescribed fire. Fire maintains ecotones, so it's not just the uplands that are burning, it's the edges around wetlands where the highest biodiversity is found, including these pitcher plants, these carnivorous plants in the picture shown. But let's step back and just ask a question. What is prescribed fire, and is it safe, and how is it conducted? And so I always start, some of these broader presentations with the anatomy of a prescribed burn. Typically, if you look at this schematic, you've got wind blowing from left to right on the screen, wind direction. We have a natural fire break. Sometimes it might be a road, but in this case, a creek that fire won't cross. And so we set fire right along that fire break in what's called a black line operation. It creeps into the wind, burning all the fuel from the surface, and eventually makes that area fireproof. And so fire managers can walk upwind and set a line of fire, which we call a head fire, that will run into the backing fire and presumably established enough of this black line where you minimize the risk of an ember getting across that natural fire break and starting a spot fire across the line. In this way, in fact, almost every single prescribed fire is conducted in this way. It's some variation on this theme, including in areas where we have a significant amount of topography. And one of the themes that I'll touch on throughout this talk is scale. The application of prescribed fire is across all scales, just like restoration efforts. And when we think of low intensity prescribed fire on the top, maybe a few tens or 100 acres, or this aerial ignition post Hurricane Michael at Tyndall Air Force Base on the bottom, which was several thousand acres, both are prescribed fires, both are accomplishing restoration objectives. So I'm going to give 3 vignettes over the next, say, 30 minutes on restoration of ecosystems using prescribed fire. We're going to stay with the southeast to get started and talk about restoring longleaf pine ecosystems, since it's something that we're both familiar with, and it's probably one of the best developed bodies of research on how we use prescribed fire to accomplish ecological objectives. The longleaf pine ecosystem is a fire-dependent ecosystem that once covered areas, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 70 million acres from Texas to Florida up to the southern border of Virginia. And it has suffered from extensive deforestation and conversion, primarily to row crop agriculture over the last 300 to 400 years. Restoration of longleaf pine ecosystems is only accomplished through fire. It is a species and an ecosystem that cannot be managed without fire. But we think of the longleaf pine ecosystem based on its, on the tree, and yet all of the dynamics, particularly in the restoration world, are really about the understory. Trees are really easy to establish and reestablish here, and the longleaf pine, as we'll get to in a minute, is one of the most fire-tolerant species on the globe, and yet the diversity of the understory in longleaf pine ecosystems rivals that of many rainforests across the globe. We have as many as 60 species per square meter of grasses and forbs. It's dominated in this case by a bunch grass called wiregrass in the foreground, as well as dozens and dozens of species of legumes and asters. When the fire regime is frequent, every 2 to 3 years, sometimes as frequently as annually, and it's uninterrupted, it sustains this high biodiversity at fine scales. And as we try to restore remnant ecosystems, that diversity in the understory comes back really pretty quickly, particularly if we help it along with some key plantings. The longleaf pine itself plays a role of providing fuel through needle cast that covers the interstitial space between bunch grasses and allows fire to spread very evenly across the forest floor. Again, we can think of restoration here in the Southeast as a problem of overcoming habitat fragmentation and replacing a lot of the species that have been lost. It can be very small. Here's a small scale planting of a number of species, both understory forbs and grasses, as well as longleaf pine, and what we would call just emerging from a grass stage at the back end of a local high school softball field. But even at this small scale, fire is a critical piece of the restoration process. And so in the Southeast, in these longleaf pine ecosystems, we're restoring the diversity or the fuel so that we can burn, which will sustain the diversity and sustain the fuel. And so it's a self-perpetuating fire machine here in the Southeast, but one where fragmentation makes application of prescribed fire relatively safe. Here we're burning right up against schools and athletic fields. And so small scale restoration is easy and possible with fire in a way that that we don't always get across the country, and we'll touch on that in just a bit. Of course, just to illustrate how fire tolerant the longleaf pine is, you can see that just with a little bit of green needles covering that terminal bud, the fire that we just set had absolutely no impact whatsoever on the longleaf that were outplanted in this small restoration process. And one of the key aspects of reestablishing longleaf pine ecosystems with fire is to keep out unwanted reproduction of other pine species. In the top left, you've got
The forest floor is covered with young pine and dry grass.
native species, but one that's quite invasive. It's often thought of as an old field pine, comes in very rapidly without fire. It's called loblolly. And fire is being used in this sequence of photographs to kill the loblolly regeneration while sustaining the longleaf. And again, all of these are scorched, but none are hurt. And as we scale up from small sites and very focused restoration efforts to more landscape scale reforestation efforts, fire again and longleaf go hand in glove. And in the Southeast, it's relatively easy. Thinking even broader about the other species that depend on longleaf pine and fire, we come to the red-cockaded woodpecker pretty quickly. Back in the late 1980s, we thought of it as sort of the spotted owl for the Southeast, but it's really diverged in how fire has been used to manage and conserve and recover it relative to its western counterpart, that spotted owl. Red-cockaded woodpecker is a federally endangered species, which is about to be downlisted because of the efforts to recover the longleaf pine ecosystem. It's the only woodpecker that lives nearly exclusively in living pine trees, and it pecks resin wells to keep snake predators from being able to come in and eat the bird as it roosts in the cavity. And in that way, this resin well creates a cavity tree that is both good for the bird but bad for fire. It's highly flammable. And so our management of this fire-dependent species, which requires fire to sustain the habitat, but lives exclusively in trees that are now even more flammable than they were before, we tend to restore structure around these trees. You can see this is a timber stand improvement where they've reduced fuels by coming in and manually cutting around the base of that red-cockaded woodpecker cavity tree, and tried to eliminate the ladder fuels that might carry fire up into the roost hole and cavity on that roost tree. One of the fascinating parts of recovery in the Southeast of this federally endangered bird is how closely tied it is to fire. In the next few slides, I'm going to show you how landscape scale restoration efforts have really led to a landscape scale increase in this federally endangered species, unlike the relationship of fire and its at least close policy cousin there in the spotted owl in the western United States. This paper was one that we wrote really kind of thinking about how conservation and its relationship to fire and recovery of species has differed so much from east to west, and will be a theme that we touch on again throughout the rest of this talk. Let me see if... So at Eglin Air Force Base, where I used to be the fire manager and fire ecologist before that, we had one of the largest populations of red-cockaded woodpeckers. But when we started, it was actually just a large population, but one that was suffering mightily. We had a goal. One of the top 10 properties, of size. It was 500,000 acres of longleaf pine habitat there in the Florida Panhandle, and it was one of 10 populations that the Fish and Wildlife Service needed to achieve a minimum threshold of 350 breeding pairs. That's a lot of red-cockaded woodpeckers. And when we established this process back in the early to mid 1990s, we had roughly 200 breeding pairs, maybe fewer than that, and we were only capable of burning about 38,000 acres a year. Now, if you think back to the first few slides, we need fire every 1 to 3 years. I've got a 500,000 acre landscape, and we only burn 40,000 acres a year. That math doesn't work. And so we really started to focus on how much land we needed to manage with fire and where we needed to put the red-cockaded woodpecker as we grew that population to maintain processes and make fire easy. And then we came up with this management emphasis area to really focus our prescribed fire as we tried to increase our capacity threefold to more than 100,000 acres a year. We targeted 90, but we like to overachieve. By about about 2011, we had achieved that goal. So if you think about that management emphasis area and you look at all the colors, they represent a range of time since last fire back in 1998. And by 2011, the reds and oranges in this graphic here show that the average age of time since fire is 1 to 2 years. Again, we needed to achieve that 1 to 3 year return interval, and we were successful. Even though the average of the entire area still exceeded 3, is because we had some long-term, long unburned areas on the periphery, and it wasn't stopping us from recovering the bird. As you can see here, as fire increased, red-cockaded woodpecker increased just along the way. We went from in 2000, when we embarked on this tripling of fire acreage, we went from about 262 potential breeding pairs. By 2009, we had actually achieved legal recovery under the Endangered Species Act, and by 2012, we had overachieved by nearly 60 pairs of breeding pairs of red-cockaded woodpeckers. And today it's nearly 500 breeding pairs, representing one of the great conservation success stories in the Southeast. And so red-cockaded woodpeckers.
Logos included our USGS, Department of Agriculture, and the Royal Town of the Holy Faith of St. Francis of Assisi.
And fire make a restoration story easy to tell with respect to longleaf pine recovery and ecosystem management. Moving to the west, over to landscape that also used to be fire dominated, but now really represents an entirely different restoration challenge and a different restoration scale. We move into the ponderosa pine forests and a vignette that I got to give credit to Dr. Ellis Margalis, colleague at USGS out there in Santa Fe, for these slides and really helping to tell this story of success and restoration there. Because in the Southeast, there's been so much habitat fragmentation. As we've taken fire out of the system and we now seek to restore it, it's not unsafe. It's easy to do on small scales, medium scales, and large scales to accomplish restoration objectives. Whereas in the Western United States, we have a very different story. We have large, unfragmented landscapes. In fact, I'll show you in the next few slides how fragmentation has actually been reduced as we've grown more trees and taken fire out of the system. But we have forests that represent watershed level concerns. So you have landscape scale supply of water for municipalities, landscape scale fire regime problems and challenges, and restoration, whether you're working on a large or a small scale, must be done in the context of these landscape scale dynamics that we'll go through in this vignette. Just point out that that people are really getting concerned about the growing impact of wildfire on Western water supply. USGS was part of the recovery team following in the emergency response with FEMA following the Los Despensas prescribed fire escape Hermit Peak wildfire, which was the largest wildfire in New Mexico history and nearly cost the city of Las Vegas, New Mexico, their water supply as a result of impacts to the forest above the reservoir. This slide shows the tree ring data of that particular forest, the Santa Fe National Forest. And if you look from left to right, the oranges and reds in this graphic represent lots of fires that are captured in the tree ring record for the last 400 years. From 1700 to about 1900, there were frequent fires documented in these forests by pine trees that lived through them, ponderosa pine being another fire type species like longleaf. But by 1900, these greens show very few fires recorded at all. And that's the story largely across the western United States of fire suppression. And in this particular landscape, we traded fire for sheep as a means of reducing fuel, at least in the grasslands at lower elevation. This is what the forest looked like more than 100 years ago. Open understory, very similar in forest structure to the longleaf pine, right? But unlike longleaf pine, the regeneration of ponderosa pine quickly forms a thicket, a dense thicket of fuel and biomass that changes the structure of this forest. And you can see in that sequence, we've got now a fire hazard on a scale that is going to create, as we've seen, many problems.
A series of images with young trees on the forest floor growing to larger trees.
This increase in forest density also affects landscape continuity. You take this picture from that Ella showed from this paper that he and Baumet published in 2009. You can see the densification of the forests over the last nearly 70 years as we've replaced the forest that was once fire maintained, open structure with very dense thickets of both regeneration of ponderosa pine and then fire intolerant species like Doug fir.
Topographical forest images from 1935 to 2005. Increased forest density and connectivity equals greater area at risk of high severity fire.
So now in this forest, we have a landscape scale fire risk. And so unlike the fragmented nature of restoration in the Southeast, where we're bringing fire back, now we need to have an opportunity to bring fire back, prescribe fire, but our restoration efforts, both in the short term and the long term, are going to be vulnerable to landscape scale fire because of this impact of fire suppression and exclusion over the last 100 years. In the Santa Fe watershed, because they were so concerned about water supply, their restoration efforts first started with restoring structure by masticating and harvesting many trees from that watershed above the city's reservoir. The Santa Fe Watershed Recovery and Restoration Plan reduced biomass, reduced forest density back to what they originally estimated it from tree ring records.
A lone excavator in the middle of a forest on a hill.
And then treated almost 80% of the lower watershed with broadcast prescribed fire. Some of the locations there have been burned 3 times since 2005, starting to approximate the historic fire return interval that we know existed from tree ring records. And they burned year round, even some of the dry years, because now the fuels were reduced. And in that way, they were able to accomplish a landscape scale objective with their restoration efforts for the recovery and protection of watershed resources and above the reservoir of Santa Fe. Here's just a very quick depiction showing you that this landscape scale restoration treatment included a lot of mechanical thinning as well as broadcast prescribed burning in that watershed. When we think about success, get this picture, click on through, this is what it looks like. And this forest now has both seen thinning and prescribed fire, but each of those individual restoration efforts is a very small piece of a very large puzzle, and done in isolation has to be designed with the risk of landscape scale fire in mind.
People are standing in a forest with clear space between trees.
One of the biggest challenges right now facing the Western United States, and this is something that Margolis is documenting for USGS in that watershed now, is the conversion of forests to grass and shrubs. When we have a very intense fire that burns at landscape scales like Hermit Peak did this past year, or the Cerro Grande wildfire that consumed parts of Los Alamos in 2000, we see a dramatic loss of those overstory, formerly fire tolerant ponderosa pine, and when they burn again, we see a conversion to gamble oak and mountain acacia, mountain locust in these forests. And so wildfire driven forest conversion in Western North American landscapes are the context in which all prescribed fire and restoration efforts in these low elevation coniferous forests in the Southwest have to be restored under. You're constantly worried not just about what fire has burned, but is the next fire going to lead to wholesale forest conversion in a way that prevents you from ever reestablishing plants or the forest species on these sites because of the change in microclimate, as well as already experienced change in climate and exceptional drought. And so, unlike the Southeast, now you have to think about the landscape scale context that even small restoration projects are being attempted within here in the Southwest. So the rest of the talk and then some conclusion slides. Part three, and this is really one of the tragedies of the modern fire landscape, is the non-native invasive species, particularly grass, invasions across many arid ecosystems, and its altered relationship of those fire-dependent ecosystems with the fire that used to sustain them. These non-native species create alternative stable states, resulting both from invasive pests that kill overstory trees, as well as understory grasses that come in, invade, and maybe accelerate or intensify fire regimes, both in terms of frequency, intensity, or you might have an invasive species like this Melaleuca that was planted in the Everglades to try to drain the swamp, literally, and has been a landscape scale restoration effort. I'm going to just borrow some slides from the California Chaparral Institute to illustrate from California how this invasive grass fire cycle works, and how it's really impacting ecological restoration efforts, in these shrub ecosystems. If you look in the background, native chaparral was burned in 1970. It's a fire-dependent ecosystem, one that burns and recovers, with fire that's applied every 30 to 70, maybe even 100 years. But when fire becomes too frequent, as what happens with the invasion of non-native grasses, we start to get repeated fires, which have a dramatic change in the ecosystem trajectory of the chaparral. So instead of having a nice shrub recovery cycle, now we've got more frequent fire because of grass invasion. And even up here on the upper slope, 3 fires are entirely eliminating the shrub cover that would have repopulated in the absence of too much fire. This is best illustrated in some of the recent publications on the grass shrub cycle. And when we think of these invasive grasses reinforcing some feedbacks, when we see increased drought like we have over the last 20 years, we have an increase in ignition frequency because of human activities, and an increase in desiccation and nitrogen deposition. These favor the grass-dominated ecosystems, which then burn much more frequently and eliminate any of the shrubs. And even though we're talking about this grass shrub dynamic with increasing fire frequency and increasing fire intensity with chaparral, as I'll show in a bit, this plays out in other ecosystems as well.
An article figure from Causes and Feedback to Widespread Grass Invasion into Chaparral Shrub-Dominated Landscapes by Isaac Park and Daryl Jenneret. Cycle from chaparral dominated to grass dominated.
So restoration of any area in the arid Southwest has to take into account this fire invasive grass feedback. Here is a nice illustration of a fire line that was cut in. And so any disturbed area, and oftentimes where we're restoring ecosystems, we already start with disturbance that has facilitated the invasion and establishment of non-native grass species. This fire break here is full of invasive grass and forb cover in the Santa Ynez Mountains above Santa Barbara. And what happens is once those areas burn, those grasses have a foothold, and they're very, very quick to recolonize after fire, creating that feedback cycle that perpetuates the grass and destroys native shrublands. This is a very similar story that's being told in the sagebrush habitat of the Great Basin. And in this particular paper, Thresholds and Hotspots for Shrub Restoration Following a Heterogeneous Megafire, Madromino and the USGS Fresk Lab are really thinking about where is sagebrush restoration possible. And can we think about these as binary classification trees of factors that affect both the presence of it after a fire and then the probability that it can come back in, where we would need to really focus our restoration efforts, either reseeding or treating with herbicide some of the invasive grasses that we know are going to come back in after those mega fires.
Images from the research article Thresholds and Hotspots for Shrub Restoration Following a Heterogeneous Megafire, a binary classification tree of factors affecting sagebrush, and a plain of sagebrush.
Here is just a very quick depiction of how large some of these fires are. And this is this fire, Soda Fire, is one of the largest fires in the history of Idaho. It burned right there, and it came back nearly monolithic stand of cheatgrass, which is again an invasive exotic grass that allows for fire to carry sometimes every year, depending on the amount of precipitation and local climate. And in this this particular study, led by Kara Appelstein at USGS, they really start to highlight other restoration concerns and factors that we have to account for in the arid West, and that's the post-fire recovery and model transferability based on the post-fire weather. So in this case, they immediately started restoration efforts, and you know, the amount of precipitation and the trajectory of those restoration efforts was highly affected by post-fire weather, further complicating the effects of this grass and invasive grass and wildfire feedback cycle that they found themselves within.
A figure from the article Weather Affects Post-Fire Recovery of Sagebrush Steppe Communities and Model Transferability Among Sites identifies data from the Orchard Combat Training Center in southwest Idaho. Photos of salt cedar spreading aggressively next to moving water and another of a prescribed burn.
The fire feedback cycle is not just limited to grass. In the Southwest, tamarisk, salt cedar, which was brought in from about 200 years ago by early settlers, has spread aggressively and crowds out a number of native species and affects passerine bird habitat in these riparian areas. It's exceptionally flammable, as you can see on the right, and is starting to affect endangered species and represents a wildfire risk to communities that also are co-located around these riparian zones. USGS has done a number of studies with non-native tamarisk, and just to show, once it's burned, it just comes right back. It's a very vigorous resprouter, and the non-native tamarisk is really pretty much fire resistant. So what are we going to do?
Groups of burnt branches with new growth at the base of the branches.
When thinking about tamarisk and its impact on endangered species, there's been a real effort to think about biocontrol agents, as well as the combination of biocontrol and prescribed fire to start bringing tamarisk down. So once it's hit with a biocontrol agent that starts to defoliate it, we're able to then come back in and burn it to enhance the mortality, which we're desiring in order to manage for, in this case, the southwestern willow flycatcher.
Article Images of Tamarisk Biocontrol, Endangered Species Risk and Resolution of Conflict through Riparian Restoration and Synergistic Interactions between Leaf Beetle Herbivory and Fire-Enhanced Tamarisk Mortality. Figure of Distribution of SWFL Critical Habitat.
So what separates success from failure in restoration projects? All fire is inevitable. And so designing restoration with fire in mind, either the past fire that's leading to a restoration trajectory that may be successful or may fail based on the fire effects that impacted the site, or designing it with future fire in mind. If you're in the Southwest, thinking about the vulnerability to a landscape scale megafire if it's a small embedded restoration effort in those larger landscapes, or in the Southeast, designing restorations with hurricane fuels in mind. This is an aerial ignition of hurricane fuels at Tyndall Air Force Base. It's absolutely imperative that we think about both past and future fires with respect to restoration and certainly with respect to climate. And with that in mind, I'm going to end with just a couple of slides and a few thoughts on climate change and restoration. Natural as a guide is increasingly less relevant in many ecosystems. When we think about what we are restoring to, we need to also think about, if the past is no longer prologue, what is possible? And in systems like longleaf pine, where fire is very frequent. If we increase in temperature and we increase fire frequency just a little bit, it's not going to matter. But if you're thinking about arid systems where fires maybe are less frequent, understanding how future fire regimes are going to be affecting restoration, as well as affecting those communities, like type conversion and transformation of ecosystems, is going to be the new norm in producing alternative stable states where typical approaches of restoration are just not going to succeed. And so one of the things that we've been emphasizing is using species response to variability, not their optimal habitat conditions, as a guide to thinking about fire management adaptation and helping to use that adaptation to find the range of the possible, not just the historic. And I will end with this paper we published called Precisionism, Pitfalls in Restoration, thinking about the impact of overly focusing on optimal habitat condition. For the red-cockaded woodpecker, which we saw earlier in the slide, it's easy to grow with fire. And yet the recovery plan really decided that there's this optimal niche gestalt, is what they called it, where the bird just thrives. But if you look at the conditions, the broader conditions represented by this multivariate analysis of fire-dependent ecosystems and fire-type longleaf pine and eglin, the bird actually occupied many different conditions than just the optimal. And instead of thinking of these as a restoration opportunity, we might be thinking these as a future opportunity to manage variability across a rapidly changing landscape.
The population is the fastest growing large population with more than 450 breeding pairs.
And I will just leave you with this, that fire is inevitable, and it will continue to represent both local and landscape challenges to restoration efforts. And yet it's something that we can manage, and something that we, particularly at USGS and the Department of Interior, are thinking about very deeply with respect to adaptation, both to climate and in response to the arrival of invasive species. And so with that, Joe, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Kevin, so much. A lot of good information there. So we'll open it up to questions. You can either unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can drop it in the chat. And as folks are thinking, Kevin, I had some questions, and then sure enough, a few slides later, you were addressing them with your comments. And
it was a whirlwind tour across the United States, but fire is very, very contextual, and I think that's one of the take-home messages. And yet the context that we think about it in now is also changing, and creates landscape scale challenges even for local projects.
So I'm just looking at the list here of some of the attendees, and one question I was pondering was, how often do we use prescribed fire in NERDA restorations? And I don't know if folks that are attending this meeting have examples of that, but I know it's certainly something that I've heard with in more recent years with climate change, and how do we account for wildfire and changing temperatures, and how does that affect restoration decisions in terms of maybe selection of parcels for restoration under NERDA. I don't know if you have anything, Kevin, to comment further on that, or if any of the attendees do as well.
I mean, certainly, if we're thinking about the restoration efforts in the Southeastern United States, the landscape is so heavily fragmented that site selection near urban interface does complicate smoke management. But if restoration efforts are small, smoke management's not a big deal. I mean, so even the local school, longleaf pine restoration project is in the middle of town, and people are capable of burning. In the Western United States, site selection has to have some it has to have some knowledge of what the historic fire regime has been in that area, both from a restoration trajectory perspective, what are we trying to accomplish with those efforts, but then also a vulnerability perspective. And I maybe didn't highlight that enough, Joe, but as we are designing something 10 years later, if we've created fuel that's going to burn and the landscape context that you've designed that in is still heavily untreated, um, the probability of loss is excessive or excessively high. And one of the things that we know about prescribed fire and wildfire that interact restoration sites, particularly ones that come with heavy metals, for instance, is that we are capable of revolatilizing a lot of chemicals into the smoke plume and then transporting them long distances. And so, again, designing a site with long-term fire sustainment in mind is something that's being considered quite a bit, across agencies, particularly the Department of Defense, where I'm now working.
So, follow-up question on the woodpeckers, and I think that was at Eglin Air Force Base. And I think your graph probably resonated with a lot of NERDA practitioners of, yes, we want X amount of breeding pairs or individuals. Your graph ended after maybe 2012, and I was just curious, was it in the restoration monitoring plan that once a certain number of pairs, or if a target level was achieved, did the monitoring end, or was there longer term monitoring that still exists?
It still exists, but it doesn't fit on that really fancy graph that we made in 2012 to declare success. No, they still monitor all the clusters every year, but from the regulatory perspective, what is needed to be done to protect them during fire or missions has dropped dramatically. Once the Air Force exceeded 350 breeding pair, every breeding pair above that, according to the recovery plan and local documentation, became exchangeable. And so back in about that time, the 7th Special Forces, an entire city of like 6,000 people, was dropped into the middle of Eglin Air Force Base, right in the middle of habitat for the red-cockaded woodpecker. And because we had grown the population so, and that's where that slide came from, so much, the NEPA and the Section 7 consultation was done within 5 months. They knew that we were capable of recovering the population. They knew what trajectory we were on, and the 7th Special Forces, their mission was highly compatible with more fire because they both set it and were used to having prescribed fire set around them. And so that trajectory continued to go up past 500 breeding pair, and so it's now the second largest population in the Southeast, and it really is just an amazing success story. Not only because it's reduced the regulatory burden, but at some point, even the management burden has gone way down. It's just burn and forget. But yes, we did continue to monitor the bird. My apologies for the just the older slide. It looked better than the one that I had from Excel with the new data.
No, fair enough. And I think a lot of times when we're thinking about restoring and those restoration goals, the monitoring aspect can be a little bit of a black box because we don't know the trajectory a lot of times, and how to plan for that, how to budget for that. How will we, what's the exit strategy in terms of monitoring? And yeah, so that I can appreciate that you all kept that on, and it's a little bit different, I suppose, with the species you were working with, because it is listed, and that isn't always the case with under NERDA. It can be, but well, I see Sarah came on, but I don't. Sarah, do you have a question? No. Well, welcome anyway. Kevin probably doesn't feel so lonely. I'm battling some bandwidth, so I don't have my camera on today. But
Joe,
I think
just to piggyback really quickly on the monitoring point that you were making, that last slide that we showed was actually some of the ecological monitoring, and in our case, the red-cockaded woodpecker was a great indicator of success, right? Not only was it the goal, but it also is responsive to what we were trying to do. But for us, we were able to then also use that variability, the habitat variability, instead of just saying, hey, we're going to manage to the optimum and have very strict definitions of what the optimum was. We actually, through that monitoring, measured the variation of recovery and showed that the red-cockaded woodpecker was much more robust to conditions that we didn't think it was. And so we actually grew our knowledge about recovery in ways that made it a lot more efficient for us to get to population goals and continue to sustain them long term through that monitoring effort. But it was not just important in demonstrating success, but actually defining what success could be beyond what the book said.
Thanks for that. I'm still not seeing any questions, but I do have another one. I could probably go on for a long time, but I won't. When the woodpecker that was at the Air Force Base and Department of Defense management there, but some of the work that you were talking about out west, when restoration happens, this may be an overly broad question, I guess, but who are the entities that typically can restore, answer some of these restoration prescribed fire questions? If we have some practitioners that may be interested in exploring this, who are the go-to people or organizations, I guess I should say?
Well, I mean, certainly there's a tremendous amount of place-based knowledge within USGS, and ecosystems mission area has got those place-based ecologists across the West, and the work in the sagebrush, for instance, led by Fresk, our office there in Boise, is it's just got a tremendous amount of local knowledge as well as management science relationships that can be leveraged to think about restoration in an efficient and scientifically defensible way at multiple scales. It doesn't have to be the soda fire scale restoration projects. In the Southwest, the same way. USGS just got a tremendous amount of expertise. Certainly within the context of DOI or Forest Service lands, working with regional ecologists to both set restoration objectives and then look at what's been successful in the past that those land management agencies have tried is an important part of the process in the West, especially where invasive species are really creating it's not just fire and grass feedbacks, but it's fire, climate, and grass feedbacks. And because the variability in climate has been so extreme, it's producing novel effects every year. Just one quick example of that is New Mexico. So it was exceptionally dry spring, had the worst wildfire season ever in New Mexico. One was an escape prescribed fire that led to the Hermit's Peak wildfire. And then they had the wettest monsoon on record. And so the entire desert is covered in both native and exotic grasses. And, it's great for the cattle, but what's not consumed by grazing is now fuel for a fire season next year that could just simply be driven by wind and not drought. And so these kind of cycles in fire are complicated. And in the West, being able to leverage local land managers that see these kinds of extreme swings and variation is important, I think, for planning and executing restoration projects.
Great, thanks. I really wasn't trying to get a USGS plug in there, but it's true that is where you've come from most recently, and certainly those other groups you mentioned too. My last question is, have you had experience working with tribes or nations and using their knowledge for setting restoration goals when it comes to fire?
Less experience than I would like. However, we have started a number of projects with both tribes and BIA over the last year under Bill, and there's an extensive amount of opportunity. I think with tribes right now in both tapping into some of the local knowledge, local practices. For instance, our pilot project in the USGS Innovation Landscape Network started with San Carlos Apache tribe and a project funded by BIA, where we've now not only trying to talk about next generation monitoring tools to make monitoring more efficient, say with ground-based lasers, but also working with tribes to define values and to be able to map and assess values at risk through USGS social science and economists there at our offices in Fort and the Southwest Biological Science Center. And so we are starting to work with tribes much more. I have started working with tribes more, but you know, it's something that partnerships there can be exceptionally long lasting, and that's very it's very rewarding. You know, they don't want you know, just advice or coming in and doing short-term projects. And when I think about these, think about more and more restoration success is governed by 10 to 20 to 30-year processes. And so, you know, working with tribes and building relationships in a way that both fits what they want as well as sort of taking advantage of what they know is probably going to be even more important in defining successful restoration strategies in a rapidly changing climate.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Sarah put in a link to EcoShare, which is the area ecology program for the Forest Service Western Region Share, or a place to share information. So Sarah, thanks for that. I won't ask any more questions, Kevin. We can talk offline, but it doesn't look like I see any hands raised with other questions, but I do appreciate your presentation today. And folks, Kevin is no longer with USGS, so I'm not going to drop in his contact information, but do appreciate the time, and we look forward to seeing everyone on the next webinar. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for having me.